The story I was told happened a long time ago. It happened in a luxurious apartment complex in the neighborhood where I lived. There used to be a very nice apartment located on the top floor of the building, and it had the most expensive rent in the area. Previously, the room was rented by a young couple. The wife often had a habit of bathing at night and staying in the bathroom for a long time to clean herself before going to bed. At that time, as usual, the wife locked herself in the bathroom, but after waiting too long without seeing his wife come out, the husband would stood outside and impatiently called his wife. Afraid of her husband's anxiety, the wife tried to finish quickly to get out and let her husband use the bathroom. Standing alone in front of the large mirror in the bathroom, she suddenly felt pressure in her heart. She felt that the atmosphere in the bathroom today was a bit quieter and colder than usual. Outside, she heard the sound of footsteps slowly approaching. The footsteps kept echoing, but she immediately realized that it was not her husband's footsteps. While she was busy observing the door outside in front of the mirror, another image of her was looking at her with horrible eyes. The young girl at first still didn't know what was happening to her. She still calmly took a towel to wipe her face quickly. But it was also at that moment when her eyes involuntarily glanced at the large mirror opposite her. She saw the reflection in the mirror that was a bit different from herself, which surprised her. She hadn't been able to determine if what she saw was an illusion or not when suddenly the person in the mirror glanced up at her and gave her a devilish smile. When the wife saw it, she panicked and screamed. Her feet quickly stepped back, her face became very pale. Then, following her inertia, she fell and hit the door. Her whole body fell and she couldn't even stand. She once again looked in the mirror to check, but the woman in the mirror had disappeared as if nothing had happened. Her husband outside heard the noise, so he rushed inside and opened the door to check. But because she was so scared, she could only stand shaking. She did not know how to tell her husband the strange story. She could only stammer unclear sentences. Her eyes were looking into the mirror for a signal. Unfortunately, when her husband appeared, those strange things ended. However, her husband thought that she was so tired that she was confused, and he took her out. But the woman was sure that someone was looking at her. When the bathroom door was closed, the strange woman immediately reappeared with a face full of intrigue. That night, the family of this young couple who had just moved in encountered a strange disaster that they had never seen before. When the wife tried to tell her husband about the horror story she encountered, the husband remained silent, his face showing contempt, and he did not believe what the wife had said. That silence made the wife feel angry. She blurted out saying goodbye to her husband, but he had just lowered his head as if silently agreeing with what she said. After a while, the two of them argued loudly with each other. The first time the husband got too angry with his wife and then loudly proposed to break up. After he finished speaking, he quietly walked out, while the wife looked at her husband silently, feeling that there was something very disappointing in her heart. That night, she stayed alone in the newly rented room and burst into tears, thinking that her husband's feelings had changed and no longer loved her as before. In the middle of the night, she sat waiting for her husband in the living room, but still did not see her husband return home. The young wife was sad. She was holding her face while sobbing. Right at that moment, from the bathroom suddenly appeared the figure of a woman gliding towards the wife, her eyes constantly looking at the wife crying on the chair. She stood beside the wife silently. Apparently, the wife didn't even know about the strange woman's presence in the room. The only thing she could do at this moment was burst into tears like a baby. The sadness just killed her heart. Seeing that, the woman took advantage of the opportunity. She bent down and whispered into the wife's mind extremely negative things about the love that she and her husband had for each other for so long. The wife felt that this woman was telling the truth, so she stopped crying and looked at the strange woman with a very pitiful expression. The woman's eyes suddenly lit up like two car lights and kept looking at the girl in front of her for a second. Then she gave a devilish smile, her eyes also shining scarily as if she was plotting something. The young girl was immediately hypnotized by the witch's gaze, becoming lifeless and insane, no longer aware of anything else. After that, she stood from afar, directing the young wife to do foolish things to be able to hold her husband's pity. The wife obeyed the witch's words, subconsciously went to the cupboard in the room and took out a sleeping pill bottle. But there was one thing that the wife still did not expect. That was, this wooden cabinet was actually the closet of an old owner who used to rent this room. Even the sleeping pill she found was a bottle that had been in the cupboard for a long time, that she had not cleaned since moving there. At first, she looked at the bottle in her hand with a little hesitation, but when the strange woman appeared and whispered in her ear, immediately she poured all the pills in the bottle into her hand and drank them all at once. She could feel the discomfort and burning slowly in her body. A moment later, with the effect of pills causing the girl's body to appear convulsive, saliva also flowed on both sides of her mouth, the wife immediately passed out on the floor with a cold body. The last images she saw were of a strange woman with a smile that couldn't take her eyes off her. She smiled delightfully. It seemed that this witch had been wanting this for a long time, and she was enjoying it very much. The whole room then sunk into the cold. No one knew that the young wife was in trouble in that room. Fortunately, the husband, because he didn't call his wife, he worriedly ran home. When he arrived, his wife's body became much weaker. He saw his wife lying on the floor and immediately ran over to check on her. As soon as he arrived, he found a long-expired sleeping pill lying on the floor, a hunch that seemed to tell him something. He immediately called an ambulance and ran to help his wife up. He was so worried at the time. The wife then opened her eyes slightly when she heard her husband's call, but her body was already frozen and couldn't move at all. A few minutes later, the ambulance also appeared. The husband and a few other doctors together took the wife into the ambulance and took her to the hospital. Fortunately, the wife was discovered in time, so her life was saved, and when she regained consciousness, she told her husband everything. The husband then began to believe what his wife had said and learned about the history of the room from the people around, and then he found out that the young woman used to rent this house to live with her boyfriend. While they were living there, somehow the two of them had a big fight. Then the cold husband left, leaving his wife alone in the house. The wife then, because she was too traumatized and she thought about it, used sleeping pills that were in the house to commit suicide and died right in that bedroom. After discovering the girl's body, the building staff also cleaned it up, but the remaining belongings of the girl were still intact, which inadvertently caused the girl's soul to stay there and unable to get out. It seemed like the ghost was waiting for other women in the same situation to incite them to commit suicide in her place.
I was only 10 years old that year, and my parents worked far away, so I had to stay at my grandmother's house for a while. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, so she lived alone. When she heard that I was coming to stay, my grandmother was very happy. She loved me very much and took good care of me, but I was a very rude child. I frankly disparaged the food she cooked because it was not delicious. I was also very harsh on a few other things that made her very sad. Looking back on that period in my life, that was in the countryside and was quite interesting. After dinner, I and a few neighborhood kids played around. My grandmother and her friends would sit and chat while watching us. That evening, my grandmother needed to take some things to my aunt. She told me to come home earlier and look after her house. But she was gone for a long time, about 2 to 3 hours, and it was getting dark outside. The children who played with me all had to go back home to go to bed already, leaving only myself and a few older people sitting around. There was no one to play with, so I went back home. Since I was home alone, I decided to close every door. When I finished, I waited all by myself. After waiting for my grandmother for a while, I started getting tired and fell asleep. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening and she still hadn't come home yet. As I fell asleep, I started to hear noises inside of the house. I heard someone walking around, but the footsteps were very light. At first I thought my grandmother might have been back, and that's when I woke up and I thought again that something might have been wrong, because her footsteps was not light at all. I wondered if it was a thief, and I was thinking about what to do next when I heard a man call someone else's name. This person's voice sounded very sad, and the last syllable was still lingering from afar and near, making me shiver. The man came out of the kitchen, and his legs were hovering in the air. He suddenly lifted the curtain, as I was scared to death. The figure of the older man, with eyes bulging, his dry smile and hideous whisper, still haunts me to this day. I was so scared that I buried my head in a blanket to hide, and I cried without a sound, scared, clenching my fists and whispering to my grandmother to come back soon. Even so, I could still sense that the ghost was doing something. He seemed to be wandering around the house, calling out someone's name and searching for things. Then, seemingly finding nothing, he slowly returned to the kitchen. I don't know where I got the courage from, but as soon as I heard silence, I decided to open the window and get out of there. As I walked out the door, I dared to cry, and as I ran, I cried and cried for my life. Unfortunately, my grandmother had not yet returned. She was probably still spending time with people nearby. Seeing me crying like that, the ladies in the street immediately asked me what happened. I panicked and told everyone what happened. The information I gave them confused all of them. One of the men in the neighborhood picked up some sticks and went to my grandmother's house. He searched everywhere with his friends, looking inside and outside, but not seeing anything strange like I did. A neighbor asked me again if the door was closed or not, and how could outsiders get in if it was? And even if they did, they couldn't get out so quickly. They asked me if I'm sure I wasn't dreaming. I knew I wasn't dreaming, and I assured them that the ghost was looking for someone named Bella. The neighbors told me that Bella was the name of my grandmother. This I did not know. The lady next door kept asking me what the eccentric man was looking for in my grandmother's house. She and a few others found it a bit strange. Seeing me alone was also not good, so a few people stayed with me to wait for my grandmother to return. After a while, my uncle appeared. He took me to the hospital to see my grandmother because while she was away, she had a heart attack and had to be hospitalized for urgent treatment. On the way, I was very nervous. At the hospital, I quickly ran to the room where she was lying. My grandmother's health had stabilized. I told her what happened at their house, and everyone was stunned, not knowing if it was an omen, because at the time the strange man appeared to me. That was exactly the same time my grandmother was receiving emergency heart treatment.
This scary story happened in 2004 when I was a kid. That year I got chickenpox. My parents asked the teacher to let me stay at home, not having to go to class. But that time my parents had to go to the city for a week. Before leaving, they told me not to leave the house lest I infect other children. Even though I didn't want to, I had to stay at home, just hoping for a quick recovery. I thought to myself, so I have to stay at home until this chickenpox is completely cured? I was contemplating whether to sneak out or not when I heard my grandmother call. She told me not to go out, then asked me to come in to eat dinner. So every day I had to stay at home like a prisoner. I felt bored. At that time I looked like an autistic child. I had to play alone in the front yard. While playing in the yard, I suddenly heard a group of friends calling my name outside. This sound was very familiar, so I quickly climbed up the wall to see what they were up to. I climbed up the wall and saw my friends. They were planning to spread their nets to the river to catch fish. I was never absent when we went fishing together before, and now I felt helpless when I saw my friends having fun. My friends saw the chickenpox on my face, so they told me I wasn't cured yet. Well, you stay at home, don't come out here and infect us. After that, they left. Although I was very disappointed, there was nothing I could do about it. I regretfully watched my friends leave. But at the same time, I suddenly saw what seemed to be a figure standing in the corner on the side of the road. Even though she was hidden in the dark, I still recognized the shoes of Umi, a girl from my neighborhood.
Hey!
I called out to her loudly. I thought she might be hiding from the boys by standing in that corner because they often bullied and teased her. But it was strange that Umi stood motionless in the dark. No matter what I called her, she ignored me. I felt very strange because Umi liked to play with me before. When I was about to call Umi again, my grandmother came out of the house and saw that I was climbing a dangerous wall, so she hurriedly asked me to climb down. My grandmother was worried that I might fall, so she rushed over to help me climb down. I told her that I saw Umi outside and wanted to go out with her for a while, but I didn't expect my grandmother's face to suddenly change at that moment. She took me into the house, told me to turn on the TV to watch. She didn't even let me play in the yard anymore. Coincidentally, Umi's grandmother also came to our house that night. I was lying in bed and reading a book when I heard a knock on the door. My grandmother hurried out. Umi's grandmother came looking for her, not knowing if it was something important. I didn't hear what they were saying in the living room. I just saw the two grandmothers shaking their heads and sighing for a while. Something seemed to be bothering them. They talked for more than an hour. Then Umi's grandmother got up to leave. Seeing that, I followed the door and asked Umi's grandmother if she could let Umi come over to play with me the following day. But I didn't know what's going on. Umi's grandmother didn't answer me but left with a gloomy face. I thought to myself that maybe she was worried because I would spread chickenpox to Umi, so she didn't want Umi to come and play with me. After a few days, I was depressed because my chickenpox still didn't heal. Staying at home drove me crazy, so I climbed up the wall to look at the people passing by. This actually made me feel a little less sad. I unintentionally turned my head and saw a person standing in the corner. As soon as I saw the shoes, I knew it was Umi.
Hey!
I happily greeted her in the most friendly way, with the same old question, but it was still the same as before. Umi was still standing there, motionless. She was still hiding in the dark, huddled in a corner like last time. No matter how I called her, there was no response. I thought maybe Umi was mad at me. I found it very strange. I wanted to know what she was doing to stand motionless for several days. So I sneaked past my grandmother to open the door and go out. When I went out, I tiptoed very softly. I also wanted to play a little prank right to startle Umi when she's not paying attention. But before I got closer to Umi, I realized that something was wrong with her. Umi was standing upright, nestled behind an electric pole. At that time, the light was a bit dim. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could still vaguely see her face slightly dazed. I thought someone was bullying her, so she got a little sad and hid here. I called out to her and slowly approached her. As I got closer, Umi now seemed to notice me. She suddenly stared at me. At this moment, her face hidden in the shadows appeared. But when I got a good look at her, I was scared to pee in my pants. I saw that one side of Umi's face was gone, and there was a big hole in it. I had never seen such a horrible sight. I was so scared that I was speechless. My brain paused for a long time before reacting. I turned my head and ran away with a scream. I knew it wasn't Umi. Definitely not Umi. I ran home lifelessly, Umi still standing there and not chasing me. I was so scared that I could only hide in bed, and I had a high fever that very night. Because I had high fever, my mother also came home quickly. That night, both my grandmother and mother were very worried about me. After tossing and turning all night, my fever disappeared the following morning, and my chickenpox had also healed. Seeing that I was okay, my mother and grandmother were relieved. I quickly told them that I had seen Umi's terrible face yesterday. Grandma said that when I got chickenpox, my father took me to the hospital for a checkup. Umi had waited for me in that alley. She wanted to wait for me to come back to play with her. But suddenly, there was a truck turning in. The driver took the wrong road because of drunkenness. Therefore, he drove the car into a narrow alley. The driver failed to control the speed, and Umi was too scared not to get out in time, so she died under the wheel. When Umi died, her head happened to be sandwiched between the front of the car and the wall. The poor little girl lost half of her face. Regarding Umi's death to this day, when I think about it, I still blame myself. She died because she was there, waiting for me to come back so we could play together. This story happened when I was a kid. At that time, my father was busy on business, so he was rarely at home. During the day, my mother was busy with work, so she could only send me to my grandmother's house in the countryside.
Wow.
Grandma loved me very much. She often cooked a lot of delicious dishes for me. It was true that only I was loved by Grandma the most when I returned to my hometown. Mom saw that I was used to this place, so she told my grandmother that she would send me here to play for a while. My mother thought my grandmother would be annoyed, but no, she was extremely happy about it. My grandma even said that she could let me stay with her forever. That night, my mother arranged the place to sleep and prepared some necessary things for me when I was here. Before going to bed, my mother asked me if I wanted to go to the bathroom. My mother said that she wouldn't take me to the toilet if I wanted to go at midnight because the toilet was not in the house here. Hearing that, I immediately understood what my mother meant, that she was afraid of ghosts, so she wanted me to go with her. I laughed and teased her that she was so old but still afraid of ghosts. So my mother gave me a strong knock on my head, causing my head to swell with a huge lump. I reluctantly took my mother out to the toilet. It was true that space here was very dark and lonely, quite scary. Because there was no need to go to the bathroom, I waited outside for my mother. Suddenly the air turned cold. The night was dark. The shadow of the trees outside was like a shadow of a person. It looked very ghostly under the moonlight. My eyes just looked around in boredom, and I was quickly attracted to a black shadow. To see clearly, I took a few steps closer. The shadow looked like a person, but it was also quite strange because the neck of the black shadow was long and very weird. So I judged that it must be a tree or a stone pillar. With this in mind, I was curious to see what exactly it was. To my surprise, that shadow moved on its own. Exactly the head of the shadow moved automatically. I paused for a moment, my heart beating faster, and wondered what the hell was that shadow. Was there a ghost? I suddenly stopped and dared not to move forward, so I mustered up the courage to ask if anyone was there. At this moment, a black shadow suddenly appeared and moved slowly in front of me. I froze, held my breath, and asked who it was. The space was quite dark now, so I couldn't see the person's face. The person suddenly stopped and made a humming sound in his throat, sounding like he was trying to say something but couldn't. At this point, I felt so scared that I couldn't even move my legs. Suddenly, I felt the footsteps of that person moving. The shadow once again moved towards me. My eyes widened and the figure of the person slowly appeared behind the wall. I would never forget his face in my life. It was a face full of folds and the skin was mushy like a lump of mud, which could fall off at any moment. The scariest part was his very long neck that made him look very tall and thin like a rotten tree. He groaned as he walked, waving his thin arms as if trying to catch me. With all my might, I ran away, literally being chased by ghosts. At this point, my mother just came out of the toilet and I bumped into her. My mother seemed a little worried seeing me like this. She asked me what happened. I just saw the Bugaboo. I stammered nervously and pointed in that direction. Hearing that, my mother also expressed fear. She immediately pulled me into the house. Because my mother and I made a lot of noise, Grandma came out from the inner room and asked us what happened. My mother was scared and said I just saw a ghost outside. I wanted to explain that it wasn't a ghost, it was a Bugaboo, because that guy looked a lot like the Bugaboo movies I had seen. Hearing that, my grandmother reassured me. She asked me to tell her in detail what I saw. I told my grandmother about the location where I met it, right behind the garden, near the toilet. After hearing that, Grandma's face suddenly darkened. She asked me if I had communicated with that Bugaboo. I recalled the scene at that time. I said that because I was so scared, I only asked the Bugaboo a few questions, then ran for my life. When I told my story earlier, my mother scolded me a little for daring to stop and talk to that Bugaboo. As soon as I heard my mother scold me, I felt that I was unfairly scolded, so I rushed to hug my grandmother and sobbed. Then Grandma dragged my mother out, and the two talked for a while about the incident. Then my mother took me to the bedroom early. To reassure me that I was not afraid anymore, my mother promised to sit and watch me when I fell asleep. Then she would go back to Grandmother's room. So I also slept peacefully. While I was sleeping, something was wrong. I heard strange noises coming from outside. The sound sounded very familiar. I opened my eyes. I couldn't see my mother anymore. Perhaps my mother had already gone to her room to sleep, and I was alone in bed. Suddenly, from the door, the fearsome Bugaboo appeared again. This time I could see the terrifying appearance of the Bugaboo. At this point, I was extremely scared because now I had nowhere to run. The Bugaboo came towards me and grabbed my hand at a very fast speed. He pulled me out of bed. Everything happened in an instant. I could feel his scary, bony hand. For a moment, I struggled hard, and my hand slipped from those ghastly hands. He turned to look at me, clearly angry, as if he wanted to eat me alive. Suddenly, he grabbed me by the nape of the neck and dragged me outside. I struggled with all my might, but couldn't resist him. Suddenly, there was the sound of breaking bowls. I didn't know where the sound was coming from. There was no direction, but it seemed to be from all around. He seemed to be very afraid of the sound, and his wrists began to loosen. Then he became scared, in pain. His whole body was shaking. Then he immediately ran out to escape. I felt like I'm going to stop breathing now. The strength of his arm was too tight. When I regained consciousness, I burst into tears and called out to my grandmother and mother. When my grandmother and mother ran in, they said it was all a dream. I just had a nightmare. Because I was still scared, I hugged my mother tightly and cried for a long time. My mother reassured me that maybe it was because I was obsessed with that Bugaboo, so I had such a nightmare. Then my mother hugged me and went to my grandmother's room to sleep with me, so I wouldn't be afraid. But at that moment, I discovered something that made me feel puzzled. I saw a lot of broken bowls on the ground. That night, when I slept with my mother and my grandma, I had no more nightmares. As for the broken bowls on the ground, my mother later explained it to me. It turned out that the sound of broken bowls could ward off evil spirits. And that night, Grandma had a few bowls that she couldn't use, so she took out a dozen bowls from the cupboard and threw them all away. The effect was obvious. I still didn't forget the scene where the Bugaboo grabbed his head and ran out of my room. However, there was still an unanswered question as to why the Bugaboo had such a long neck. Until one day, I heard my grandma say that the Bugaboo that haunted me that day was a ghost that resided at the end of the village. When the ghost was alive, he used to be a child kidnapper. Later, because of debt and his wife left him, he hanged himself. Since then, he had become a ghost that specialized in harassing children in the village.
Their natural way of doing things does not always change, but once they become domesticated or dominated, they will tend to do good deeds to accumulate virtue. This story is an example. I remember when I was in the 5th grade of elementary school. One day during the winter break, it was snowing outside and it was too cold to go outside. My parents were at a clothing store doing business. They were too busy to care about me that night, so I just watched TV alone at home. I was cold, so I had to burn coal in the pot to keep warm while baking potatoes and watching TV. I was so occupied that by the time the movie ended, it was dark and freezing outside. The temperature had not increased at all. I decided to eat the whole roasted sweet potato belly, so I was not hungry anymore. My parents came home very late, so I didn't wait for them. I didn't know what to do that day, as I felt very sleepy and couldn't keep my eyes open. so I just passed out on the chair. When I woke up, my parents weren't home yet, so I turned off all the lights and went into my room to sleep. Coal was still burning. It was cold. I didn't know how long I would sleep for, but I slept very well. The night was quiet. There was a sudden noise outside my room. I was very tired, but I heard the sound coming from outside the window as if someone was knocking on the door. Because I was so sleepy, I couldn't wake up immediately, and after a while, I heard the sound of chickens in the yard scattering as if someone was chasing them. I thought my parents were coming back home, so I didn't care. I just thought that they would wake me up after the meal was prepared. The strange thing was that I didn't hear them at all. And after a while, I heard another knock on the window again, and this time louder and more urgent. It was so noisy that I couldn't sleep any further. I had to get up to look, and when I saw a figure standing outside the window with eyes looking at me through the bars, I was startled. It was very dark, but for some reason this man was leaning against the window. Although I couldn't see his face clearly, I was sure it wasn't my parents. Seeing me staring blankly, he also didn't move. Then the figure began to slowly wave at me, as if to signal for me to go out and meet him. I did not know who it was. I thought it might have been a village friend who came to visit me. Where could I play in this cold weather, I wondered. I didn't want to get out of bed, but I had no choice but to get up and go solve this issue because that person refused to leave. I didn't know if it was because I stood up suddenly or if something else happened, but I felt sudden dizziness and fatigue. I didn't have any energy or strength to walk, but I finally managed to get out of the room. Stunningly, I stepped out and just opened the door. A cold wind was blowing and making me shiver. I felt a little bit better inside. I saw the figure standing by the chicken coop. The young man looked very thin. He looked like a 14 or 15-year-old boy who seemed to be looking at me, although I didn't know that for sure. We weren't far from each other, but I couldn't see his figure or clothes, only a vague figure surrounding by the blue light. The young man was also strange. No matter how much I asked him, he didn't say a word. Seeing that, I curiously walked down the steps and walked towards him. I wanted to see who he was and what he came for, but as soon as I stepped down the stairs, I felt my whole body lose all strength, paralyzed in the snow. After falling to the ground, my face turned to the sky. I could only feel my eyes spinning. And at the moment, I saw a short figure holding a chicken in his hand. He came to my side and looked down at me slowly. Because of his short figure, when he looked down at me, we were face to face, and I finally started seeing who he really was. The young man's body proportions were strange. His body was terrifying, plus his limbs were short. Even weirder than that was that he had animal ears, and as he got closer, I saw the rest of his true form. His face was full of fluff. His mouth was pointed like a fox's nose, and his skin was yellow. I finally concluded that he was a wild ferret. The strange hairy face, less than 30 centimeters away from me, was still smiling. He lowered his head and stared at me for more than a minute. While watching me for a while, he turned around and left with a chicken in his hand. And then my vision became increasingly blurred. After he left, my eyes completely darkened and I lost consciousness. I was in a coma not long before my parents returned, and as soon as they entered the yard, they found me lying unconscious in the snow. Seeing this scene, the two of them rushed over, hugged me anxiously, and called my name over and over again. And this is when my father saw what has happened in the chicken coop. 7 or 8 chickens were slashed by their throats, and my father cursed whoever did this. After hearing my vague account, the whole family knew it was the yellow ferrets, so my dad decided to punish him. But that was not as important as I was, and my mother also hurriedly urged my father to quickly take me to the village infirmary. At the time, the infirmary was located on the premise of the village committee, and it was an old doctor in the village who examined me. After being examined, the doctor said that I was not bitten by a ferret, and the cause of my coma was carbon monoxide poisoning. Later, when my parents thought about it, and they went back to the house to get all the things, they were surprised to see that the house was filled with charcoal smoke. I closed the door that night so that the gas would not escape. I also told them that the reason I went out was that someone resembling a ferret called out to me. According to the doctor, if the yellow man hadn't knocked on the window to let me out, I would have stayed in the house and continued to fall asleep, and probably wouldn't have woken up at all. Hearing that, the next day my father immediately went to the city to buy some more chickens and placed them in the chicken coop and waited for the ferret to come and steal them as a way to repay and thank him for saving my life.